Welcome everyone, good afternoon. My name is Yolanda Suarez-Balcazar. I am a professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the president of the Society for Community Research and Action. With me are Milton Fuentes, professor at Montclair University, and Helen Neville, professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and the president of Division 45. It is our pleasure to present this seminar to you. This seminar is part of my presidential initiative on conversations about diversity and inclusion, and the first one in a series of conversations. This event is co-sponsored by SCRA, Council on Cultural, Ethnic, and Racial Affairs, SARA, and Division 45. We believe that having meaningful conversations about diversity and inclusion in challenging times like the ones we are living now in this country are critical. They're not necessary, although we know they are not easy. Each of us will speak for about 18 minutes, and at the end, we will have 30 minutes for questions. Please type in your question on the screen, and we will be ready and we will read it out loud, or raise your hand and we will give you access to the slide to speak. By the end of the webinar, you will be able to understand the importance of addressing issues related to diversity, inclusion, privilege, intersectionality, race, and learning environments. You will be able to identify strategies and best practices on how to create an environment that invites for reflection. You will be able to describe best practices for managing discomfort and resistance. You will be able to outline ways to promote inclusion with students of color and respect for all. And we trust that by the end, you'll be committed to activities for continuous self-reflection and action. Introducing and understanding the concept of diversity can be a complex task. Most definitions circumscribe diversity to a full range of human characteristics in the sociological, historical, and cultural context. In particular, we included the definition groups that have been discriminated in this country, but also inclusive of groups that are often excluded from conceptualizations of diversity, such as people with disabilities or individuals who might share several identities, intersectionality. Key here is to truly understand the lived experience of individuals from diverse backgrounds. Some race scholars may argue that we need to be careful when defining diversity and not to ignore the historical or pervasive discrimination experienced by people of color. They also argue that often diversity and identity get introduced in such a way that all groups become equal, and therefore we're ignoring race and racism. Race scholars also argue that people of color within each of these different identities are still at a disadvantage due to racism. For instance, the feminist movement benefited primarily white women. The LGBT movement benefited primarily males, white males, and so forth. So it is most useful when diversity is introduced as a value, in place, in context, and attention is given to the lived experience, and diversity is put into practice. The concept of diversity does not necessarily mean equality, equity, or social justice. Therefore, a broad definition is not enough. We find it in our work that it's important to introduce diversity, not only its definition, but as a value. I would like to share segments of the diversity statement developed by the Council on Cultural, Ethnic, and Racial Affairs, SARA, of SCRA. I also want to recognize the leadership of Jessica Shaw Fernandez and Jerry Pelmer in helping developing this statement. So in that statement, they introduced diversity as a value. Diversity as a value, meaning active appreciation and affirmation that individuals and communities deserve to be recognized for their uniqueness and their differences. Diversity as a value is seen as a strength, an asset of an organization or a community. Diversity is also seen as individuals and institutions being open to differences. As a value, it's also being recognized that not only individuals, groups, and communities, but that diversity is intrinsically, that no one is intrinsically superior to another, that no group is superior to another. It also involves holding ourselves and institutions accountable for ensuring that resources and supports are available to ensure inclusivity, equity, and equal opportunity. Having diversity as a core value, and for individuals, institutions, and communities to declare it as such is not only a priority, but a value that guides the group's efforts. Having diversity and inclusion as core values also means institutionalizing the commitment to diversity and being intentional about embracing diversity. Next, I would like to share Sarah's perception about diversity as praxis, diversity in practice. This is a very critical element. How do I move diversity as a value to diversity placed in practice? Practicing mutual respect for qualities and experiences, respect for differences, exploring differences in a safe and positive environment, moving beyond tolerance to embracing celebrating diversity. We often emphasize too much tolerance. That's not enough. That's not really about valuing diversity. We need to move from tolerance to embracing it, to adopting it as a value and place it in practice. Acknowledging that people have the right to be different. And understanding that diversity includes not only ways of being or ways of doing, but also ways of knowing. Recognizing that personal, cultural, institutional discrimination creates and sustains privilege for some while creating and sustaining disadvantages for others, in particular those that are considered different from the dominant social group. Building alliances is another critical step. Alliances across groups so that we can eradicate all forms of discrimination. And building alliances across groups doesn't necessarily mean just looking for our commonalities, but respecting our differences. Embracing the discomfort of not knowing, which in the literature is often called as practicing cultural humility. Basically, people are ready to open and ready to learn. Diversity and inclusion. Traditionally in the literature, we often think of diversity as people having a voice, and that's not always necessarily the case. Traditional conceptualization of diversity do not necessarily mean inclusion. Diversity neither means social justice or equity. Often numerical diversity representation is confused with inclusion. How many of us, or how many people are invited to committees just to have a diversity of representation? Does it really mean inclusion? Maybe not. Inclusion really means that diverse individuals are empowered, are engaged, are able to have a voice, and that voice is heard, it's respected, and is valued. That they can make a difference, and that the contributions are heard. There really needs to be an institutional commitment to embracing diversity in its value and in practice, so that we really move from diversity to diversity and inclusion. Now, often, diversity and identity go together. This is a metaphor that I often use with my students and they really liked this metaphor. During the early waves of immigration to the US, people referred to the United States as a melting pot. However, this was a myth, because basically a melting pot assumed that individuals would leave behind the unique ethnicity, culture, ways of doing, ways of thinking, ways of knowing, and sometimes linguistic identity to form part of that melting pot. But if we think closely of when this metaphor was most often used and was very popular, it was during the 1890 and 1920. And most of the waves of immigration were people coming from Europe. So they were all white people. The metaphor that we use today in ethnic and cultural studies is we really want to be like a salad bowl. And what is the meaning of that? It's meaning that each unique individual wants to maintain his or her own ethnic, cultural, linguistic, cultural identity as a way to contribute to the whole. Can we coexist as a salad bowl? Can we respect each other for what we have to bring to the salad bowl? And it's a really interesting metaphor that really gets students thinking about, well, do I want to be a melting pot, or do I really want to be part of a salad bowl? And how do I respect each unique individual so that they can be what they want to be? A conversation about diversity is often a conversation about privilege. Loosely defined, privilege is any unmerited or unearned advantage. In that sense, we all have experienced privilege. Part of the privilege associated with whiteness is the luxury of not having to consider one's race, let alone the disadvantages faced by people of color. It's often a hard topic, and people have a hard time talking about privilege. People often get offended or become defensive, in particular whites. The first thought is, wait a second, I'm not racist. Oh, wait a second, I did not experience privilege. Wagner, in his piece on white privilege, makes the argument that a conversation about privilege should focus on context, should focus not about why you or people might be racist, but how people may have benefited by the racist behavior of others. I use this article as a classic in my study, with my work with students, and they really like it because it takes privilege in the context of how others might benefit, or people might benefit from the racist behavior of some. Privilege that some hold just because of skin color. Just the fact that some individuals do not have to think about the impact of the color of the skin, Wagner says, is a privilege. Or that individuals do not have to think that they might be stopped by police because of the color of the skin is a privilege. Or that they might not receive services just because of the color of the skin is a privilege. Basically, Wagner argued, if you don't have to think about the color of your skin every day, that is a privilege in itself. What is nice about this argument, according to Wagner, is that this argument eliminates the need for people to become defensive. So I highly recommend his article about privilege. So along with that, I often do an exercise about privilege. This exercise was taken from a high school teacher discussing privilege with his students. And my students in particular have really liked this exercise because it invites for a lot of reflection. I asked students to take a piece of paper, crumble the paper into a ball, and without moving from where they are seated in the class or in the room, to throw it inside a small can. a garbage can. The garbage can is placed in the middle of the room up front, and then we engage in a discussion. The garbage can is a metaphor for a basket of privilege. A basket of privilege here might be loosely defined as having access to good health care, education, a good neighborhood, social networks. And then students reflect. How did you feel about being farther away? What's interesting is every time I do it, the students in the back say, that's not fair. I'm too far away from the basket. And they throw it. And then the students that are close to the basket get really excited. Oh, I got it in. I'm close to the basket of privilege. But then we move that discussion to how does this exercise relate to your own closeness in life, to the basket of privilege, or the others that you are aware of the basket of privilege, and what conditions, situations may place people in the closer to the basket of privilege. And it's interesting to see how consistently the students come up with what is out there in the literature. They often say the color of your skin will put you farther away, the neighborhood where you were born, the community where you live. So all these issues that we know are determinants of well-being, of health, and other things. So from these discussions, students are often eager to do something. And then we get into the discussion of compassion and issues they can do because they really want to get involved and they want to be engaged. And this is kind of a nice way to move from very difficult and complex discussions about diversity into, so what do I do? What can I do? So these are examples that I've shared with my students that are taken from the Southern Poverty Law Center. Yeah, volunteer in your community, sign petitions, do something. Apathy is not an option. Ask students what they could do. What would they like to do? How they want to be engaged in the solution. Unite, talk to others, organize, join an effort. Look at all the efforts that we're seeing currently in very challenging times. Support those that are being discriminated or are marginalized. Do your homework. Learn about others and issues going on. Confront discomfort of not knowing and learn. Speak up. Demonstrate and teach tolerance and understanding, and move from tolerance to embracing diversity as a value and in practice. And this is a very important one. Go deeper. We all realize that we all have our own biases and prejudices. Sometimes these are intentional biases or stereotypes that we might use. But going deeper into our own and self-reflection, it also helps engage in this discussion. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Milton, who talked about intersectionality and setting up the environment for a meaningful conversation.
Thank you, Yolanda. Let me just bring this up here. Okay, thank you, Yolanda. So one concept that's incredibly important and related to diversity is the notion of intersectionality. I think when we first started talking about diversity, we would talk about it in a very singular way. So we talk about race and ethnicity and gender and class, not thinking about how these identity factors intersected to either enhance our identities, compromise our identities, or neutralize our identities. So for example, my being a light-skinned Puerto Rican male, my skin color or my skin tone gives me power and privilege in this culture, while my ethnic background, depending on where I am in the context that I'm in, may take some power and privilege away. By usually my last name will out me as a Latino, Fuentes, and then being a male comes with power and privilege as well. So thinking through those various identity factors and how they intersect, one comes to realize how they interrelate and how they enhance, compromise, or neutralize our identity and our functioning. So just two working definitions related to intersectionality. One is by Cole, 2009, and it invites us to give simultaneous consideration to the interconnectedness of cultural dimensions, including identity, difference, and disadvantage, And Davis also reminds us that intersectionality refers to the interaction between gender, race, and other categories of difference in individual lives, social practices, institutional arrangements, and cultural ideologies, and the outcomes of these interactions in terms of power. So wrapping up our conversation, at least as it relates to concepts, we're now going to move to setting up the context. First of all, I'd like to say hello, everybody, and good afternoon. I think I'm safe saying good afternoon. I think I'm hitting all time zones right now, and can say good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here, along with my colleagues. When we first started doing this work in terms of diversity and working with folks in the classroom, one thing we came to realize was that just sharing information with folks in a very didactic way was not very effective. James Lang will point out, he's a leader around education and learning. He will point out that knowledge base is important. We do need to have that knowledge base, but it's not enough. And so we turn to Hayes, who reminds us that a lot of our learning happens in a very interpersonal way, reflecting on ourselves, our own sociocultural profile, and how it relates to how we relate to others, and then interpersonal training, how we interact with others. I always remind my students that it's important to start with ourselves. I always use the metaphor from when we're on a plane and they remind us to put our mask on first before helping other clients. And so I just want to encourage folks on the call to be mindful of that. If we're going to do this work with students, we have to be mindful of our own background, our own sociocultural profile, and how that might inform our teaching practice across settings. I realize that there are lots of folks on the call with different training backgrounds, and so we're trying our best to provide something that's helpful to all on the call, and I think the heterogeneity provides a diverse perspective, or allows for diverse perspectives, but just being mindful that in some instances this is going to serve as a refresher for some of you, in other instances this is going to be completely new. The other thing I want to mention is just that when we do this work, especially folks of color, we don't think about the impact it's having on us directly. And I just want to recognize Dr. Jackson's work from the University of Michigan. Oftentimes when we start to talk about diversity and the downside or the challenges associated with diversity, our minds and our bodies have a reaction to all the information that's being shared with us. And this information that we're sharing right now is also going to have an impact on us today. So I just want to encourage folks to do whatever you need to do right now to take care of yourselves. I do a fair amount of mindfulness, and so I just remind myself right now, my feet are on the ground, and I feel that sensation of my feet on the ground. I am sitting in a chair, and I'm feeling that sensation of being in a chair. I'm reminding myself that I've got thoughts and feelings. However, I am not my thoughts and feelings, and I'm constantly kind of trying to stay mindful as a way of taking care of myself. So do whatever you need to do over the course of the next hour or so to be kind to yourself, compassionate to yourself, and some of this material may take its toll on us, and just take care of yourself. Engage in self-care. The other thing that some diversity scholars will point out is that we have to be clear about our values when we do this work. Know where you stand. I just want to share some values that I hold, and I'm sure my colleagues, my co-presenters hold as well. As a clinical psychologist with some training in community psychology, I believe in change. I think that the moment I stop believing in change is the moment I need to hang up this shingle and put it away and perhaps consider doing something else. I have to believe that the work I'm doing in across context is going to lead to change. And I also try to be mindful of the fact that sometimes I'm behaving in a very tertiary way. The damage has been done. Folks are engaging in racist ways across learning contexts. And so what I'm working to do is to see if I can undo some of those socialization forces. In some cases, our efforts are more secondary, where folks might be either marginalized or at risk, and there are things that I can do in the classroom to ensure that I don't push folks over the edge or into some problematic spaces. And then, of course, for some folks, maybe I can do something in a very primary way. Perhaps our work in micro settings might lead to changes in exo and macro settings, and may even lead to a different narrative. For those folks who are community psychologists, you're probably familiar with the river parable, where kids are coming down the river, and folks are jumping in to pull each child out of the river, and one person decides to run upstream, and the community gets upset and says, "Where are you headed?" And that person screams, "I'm going to go find out who's throwing the kids into the river." So we do need to be mindful that sometimes we're operating in a tertiary way because the damage has been done. But let's think about things that we can do to ensure prevention of racist attitudes, prevention of oppression, and other pernicious factors. Also, as a family therapy guy, I have a deep appreciation for narrative therapy and the notion of thick narratives versus thin narratives. With thin narratives, we think about things in a very simplistic way. So when we talk about people, for example, crossing the border and coming here, in quotes, illegally, we're not fully understanding the narrative. We're not fully understanding that perhaps there are policies that the U.S. is engaging in that may have caused people in their country to want to flee. Perhaps we've done things as a nation to make things worse in other countries, and that's why folks are headed our way. Perhaps some folks didn't cross the border, but perhaps the border crossed them when we took over aspects of sections of this country. And so when we have those conversations, we're engaging in thicker narratives versus thinner narratives. We're going to use lots of terms over the next hour or so. We're using terms like Black and white and Latinx. Those are pretty thick terms. They're nuanced, they're complex. We recognize that, and I want to just put that out there that we recognize the complexity of the terms that we're using. I also have a deep appreciation for diversity. I find that when folks are in a space and they're diverse, we tend to work harder. We're mindful of the perspectives in the room. We try to work harder in terms of sharing information with each other, thinking through the various perspectives. It leads to creativity. It leads to innovation. I also operate as a practitioner scholar. I want to make sure that what I'm doing is associated with best practices, is informed by the literature. Just because something feels good doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing the right thing. I'm also an academician who engages in active learning. I like to get folks to not only understand the concepts, play with the concepts, apply the concepts themselves to others, and so really promote active learning. One thing that we have found is that not only does active learning benefit all folks in the room, but we have found that first-generation students and Black African-American students really do benefit from active learning strategies. So when we talk about equity, that might be a way of engaging in an equitable practice. I also prefer progress over perfection. I think my co-presenters would agree that this is not easy work. This is complex work, and if we're waiting to do it perfectly, it's just not going to happen. We won't get started. So I like to get started, learn from the process, evaluate the process, tweak it, and continue engaging in an iterative process. And the other piece to bear in mind is that we do have to maintain some humility when we do this work. I don't know it all. There's a lot of great work going on right now in terms of diversity and multiculturalism. I'm trying really hard to stay on top of it. But just when I'm feeling I'm on top of things, something new comes out and I may have missed it. So just I'm mindful of that. There's some interesting research around when folks feel like they've become an expert in an area, they tend to be very confident, which is wonderful, but they also become closed-minded and dogmatic. And so we want to guard against that as we do our work. This quote really kind of captures some of the complexities and nuances of some of the stuff that we do. Between what I think I want to say, what I believe I'm saying, what I say, what you want to hear, what you believe you understand, what you understand, there are at least 9 possibilities for misunderstanding. And if you follow stuff on social media, I'm always kind of looking at when somebody makes a post of some sort, I always look to see how people respond. And I find that that oftentimes folks will misunderstand something, and all of a sudden people are defriending each other, and it's really unfortunate. So just want to share that quote to just be mindful of all the complexities associated with the work that we do. I want to introduce you to some work by Claude Steele that I think helps set the tone for creating spaces that are helpful to individuals for learning. I'm going to first read a section from his book called Whistling Vivaldi that gets at some of the research that he did in this area. He starts with In her illuminating book, The Failures of Integration, Cheryl Cashin shares a private joke that she and her husband, both African Americans, have about flights on Southwest Airlines, which allows passengers to board on a first-come, first-served basis. If they arrive late, they hope for what they call Southwest Airlines First Class. They hope that a young, dark-skinned African-American male will be toward the front of the line and will take one of the comfortable exit-advantaging seats toward the front of the plane when he boards. Cashin says, at least 4 out of 5 times, we can depend on the seats next to the black person being empty, even if his own row is far up front, begging for the taking. I'm always happy to take this convenient seat, feeling grateful for the discomfort of others and marveling at the advantage they're willing to pass up due to their own social limitations. I smile warmly at my black brother as I pop down next to him. And I think, so this story got Claude Steele to do some really important work around identity threat. And so what he found was he was curious to see what again, I'm going to use some simple terms here, what white folks do around black folks when they're having a conversation that might be controversial. So he brought white students into his research lab, and he said one of 2 things. He said to one white student, you're going to have a conversation with these students, and he showed them a picture of Polaroids of black students about love and relationships. And then another white student, he said, you're going to have a conversation with these 2 individuals, again, showed them Polaroid pictures of black students about racial profiling. Let me go get the students. They're sitting in another room filling out some questionnaires for me. Do me a favor, and can you arrange those chairs for me? In the condition where the individuals were going to engage in what might be considered a controversial conversation, where their identity threat might be enhanced, the individuals put more space between their seat and the seat of the black students. In the condition where they were going to be talking about love and relationships, this space did not exist. They didn't create this space between themselves and the black students. Some folks argued that perhaps it had to do more with the topic. Perhaps anybody who's going to have a conversation about racial profiling will put more distance between them and the individuals they're going to have the conversation with. So he did the same study, and this time instead of having black student Confederates, he had white student Confederates, and did the same exact study, brought them in, showed them Polaroid pictures of white students, invited them to arrange the chairs. And under those circumstances, there was no space created between the white students talking to white students about racial profiling. So there was, the students sat closer, or there was no distance. Some folks argued that perhaps it had to do not necessarily with the topic, but perhaps it had to do with racism. Perhaps the racists were more likely to put the space between them and the black students. So he ran the study again, and this time he had folks fill out measures related to explicit racism and implicit racism, ran the study again the same exact way, and what he found was that regardless of where you fell with respect to racism, if you were a white individual, you put more space between you and the person of color. So then he ran the study again, and he did what I think is critical here for creating a space for learning. He said, let me just move my camera here a little bit. He ran the studies exactly the same way, but this time, as the individuals were about to go set up the chairs, he said, hey, listen, tension is natural in a conversation about racial profiling. And it's typically difficult for everyone. Treat this conversation as a learning experience. That is, try to learn about the issue and more generally about how to talk about the charged issues with people who might have differing perspectives. When he ran the study and he added this prompt, individuals removed the distance. There was no more distance created. So when we start creating spaces for learning, this prompt becomes really important. We have to somehow put this verbiage into our own words and let students know this is about learning. So this is related to conversation guidelines that we want to make sure that we have when we do have these conversations with students. Over the past few years, these guidelines have been very helpful for me, and I usually invite people to add guidelines if they see something missing. Just a quick word around learning edges versus brave spaces versus safe spaces. Most folks oftentimes will refer to the spaces that we create as safe spaces. There's been some conversation around that term. if you're having these conversations in a deep way, as Dr. Nabil will point out in a little bit, sometimes these things don't feel very safe for the individuals who are involved. And so you might want to consider using perhaps a different spaces where learning edges are occurring, or perhaps brave spaces. Okay. The other guidelines that I'd like to highlight is to encourage people to remain engaged, committed, and respectful, to keep an open mind and to monitor their judgment, to listen and learn, to keep the focus on themselves, consider sharing experiences, strengths, and hopes with the group, respect privacy, and also to value and model in profession. And as facilitators of these conversations, this is a great opportunity for us to do that as well. I'm going to be wrapping up in a second here. So just Dr. Neville is going to be talking about hot moments that occur in the classroom and how to manage these hot moments. Just want to give you a quick working definition for hot moments. These occur when people's feelings, often conflictual, rise to a point that threatens the teaching and learning process. And as folks who are trying to facilitate learning in a space, we certainly don't want that to happen. They can occur during the discussion of issues where people feel very deeply around these issues, or as a result of classroom dynamics in any field. For those folks who are training clinicians, school psychologists, so on and so forth, this is where sometimes these hot moments might occur. We want to make sure we think about these hot moments as learning opportunities. They can lead to some deep learning opportunities. We want to be mindful of ourselves. What are our triggers? And Dr. Neville will talk about this, and be ready to kind of handle these hot moments and be able to kind of put ourselves in a meta space where we can kind of observe them from a distance and be ready to respond if we need to. And the other piece is we need to make sure we protect all participants. The individuals who are feeling marginalized in the experience and the individuals who are doing the marginalization. Oftentimes I'll talk about, sometimes we find folks are trying to be right rather than being correct. And kind of creating a space where folks can be correct rather than being right, because they might not necessarily be correct. They're just really wedded to their position. These are some resources that really are great around managing hot moments. Lee Warren from the Derek Bach Center at Harvard has a great resource for managing hot moments. And then we've got Shavella Pittman over at the Dominican University, who has this great piece called 10 in the moment responses for student incivility and other uh-oh, sigh, say what now classroom moments. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Nabil, who's going to spend a lot more time unpacking these notions.
Helen, your voice is, yeah.
Thank you. Okay. I want to thank Yolanda for this opportunity to talk to you about a topic that I think is incredibly important. And thank you, Yolanda and Milton, for setting the stage. And I know a lot of things that I want to follow up with you all on. I think it's incredibly engaging. And so what I'm going to be doing is really honing in and talking much more about what does this look like in the classroom? Like, how do we go about doing this? And my comments will focus on race. So I loved it when Yolanda talked about, how is it that we're thinking about diversity broadly? But I'm going to talk about race because from what I've experienced in teaching these topics for the past 20 plus years, is that race is incredibly difficult for people to engage in a conversation, and it creates an enormous amount of discomfort and resistance. And also, this is the area that I have most expertise in. So I want to start with two quotes that I think are important and set the stage and context for my comments. One is by James Baldwin, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard this. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think that's incredibly powerful. This comes along with Rich Milner, who's an educational scholar, and he's got a book out that is on racing the class. And he speaks to this more specifically on race. We've really got to disrupt and confront the attempts to not address issues of race, racism, and other forms of discrimination on a micro level as well as a macro level. And so that's what my comments will primarily be about, and then talking about why this is uncomfortable. First, let's talk about what are some unhelpful strategies. So I know that all of us have been confronted with the classroom when things go completely awry because we are thrown off guard. And Daryl Wing Su, along with his colleagues, have done some really interesting qualitative research that unpacks what are some of the unhelpful strategies that we do when we're trying to talk about race. One is allowing race talk to be brewed in silence. And this is where folks don't really address the elephant in the room, and that I'm sure all of us have been in environments where it's thick with silence and people feel uncomfortable and angry, and that's never really addressed. The other is being passive in the face of a heated exchange. And this is where faculty, and it's related to this third point, was it allowing students to take over the classroom. So this is where faculty or whoever is facilitating the learning feels so uncomfortable with the content and the exchange and don't really necessarily have the skill set to engage. So they just sit back and let things unfold without it really being intentional. And for those of you who are in the classroom or out in the community talking about these things, I'm sure you have some war stories with people who were participants in those environments coming back and talking about how they've been injured because things got out of control and the faculty person or the person facilitating didn't step in and advocate for either a social justice perspective or to try to place meaning into it. And so what that ultimately ends up doing is silencing many times the marginalized voices in the room. And the last point is cutting off the dialogue. And as if talking about the very issue is the problem, as opposed to the problem of racism being the problem. And in fact, engaging in dialogue can really help promote learning and equip people for future in terms of interracial engagement. What I'm going to talk about are these 10 strategies for managing discomfort and resistance in the classroom. And these are things that I culled from the literature. So we'll talk about setting norms. We'll talk about connecting discussions of race to these larger learning objectives. We'll talk about assessing your own feelings and triggers. We'll talk about the importance of naming the resistance in the moment, inviting multiple perspective taking, the importance of really incorporating writing assignments, and I've got some suggestions there. Connecting the class dynamics to a larger social dynamic, so it's not what's going on in the classroom is not some isolated event. We'll talk about the importance of summarizing the learning as well as a way of meaning making. And we'll end with talking about process with a colleague and evaluating action to make changes accordingly. And the last two really piggyback on some of the things that Milton had talked about, is that taking care of the self, because doing this work is incredibly challenging and difficult. So set norms to address discomfort. I think in Milton's presentation, he talked about guidelines, and I really like the guidelines that you set up. And sometimes I call it ground rules, but I like guidelines better because rules sound so like official, and guidelines seems much more flexible and encourages participation. Well, in addition to that, it's important to set norms about addressing discomfort. What I'm going to be talking about, I'll give you some examples from my work with doing multicultural education work with police recruits, teaching courses such as the psychology of women, and then also teaching multicultural issues and counseling courses and some of the other courses that I do teach. Through the years, what I realized that talking about these brave spaces or safe learning spaces or whatever we want to talk about them and coming up with those guidelines are important. But we also want to let folks know that people are going to feel discomfort and that they're going to be challenged, and that we create some norms about how we want to challenge that discomfort in the room. And that way, and we can continually revisit this, that way when we're third week into the semester or fourth week into the semester or third lecture with the police, that we can revisit these norms about, remember we had talked about this, and here are some of the things that you all said would be helpful. I have some kind of questions that I think would help guide this. How do you feel when you talk to someone who expresses a different opinion about race or racism? And I think this feeling piece is really hard, so sometimes you might want to model that for people because, you know, we as psychologists, many of us are trained to tap into our affective responses. Other people, like when I work with the police, aren't trained to talk about affect and feeling. And so really assisting and modeling what that might look like for folks is helpful. What fears do you have about talking about race and racism? And I find that's really helpful because people then talk about not wanting to appear racist, not wanting to be stupid, not wanting to be attacked. So all of these things can come up and we can, people can create a shared community about those fears. What does discomfort and resistance look like in the classroom? And I think this is particularly important because I then refer to these look like in the classroom as discomfort when I see and notice it later on in the semester. It looks like silence. It looks like people rolling their eyes and refusing to talk. It looks like voices raised. It looks like, so people can kind of name that. And we want to look at the emotions. We want to look at some of the thoughts, and we also want to get to those behaviors that we know that there's resistance in the room. And then we set some norms about what are some of the ways we can address the discomfort and resistance in the room. So that's just setting norms. In terms of connecting the discussion of race and racism to learning objectives, I just have this quote here from Lonnie Guinier. I'll let you all read it just because I think it's a powerful quote. But what I think a lot of times is people ask the question like, well, what does this have to do with my life, my work? Why do I need to learn this? And I have a non-race example that I'd like to share. I've always known when I used to take exercise classes, they said, you really need to stretch before and afterwards. Oh, you really need to drink water. And because, you know, I was like, well, why? Why do I have to do this? And my younger self was like, that didn't, no big deal. My older self is now wishing I would have listened more to those exercise things as my body had aches and pains, etc. So the idea is it would have been really helpful if someone said, here's the reason why you need to stretch. Here's what it does for your body. It provides a rationale and it allows me to want to comply. So in terms of connecting, why are we having these conversations about race and racism? And how is it related to your specific learning objectives? So in terms of working with the police recruits, how is this related to the work that they are actually going to do? And that has been really hard for us because we're thinking about abstract notions about race and racism to concrete ways of interacting with people on a day-to-day basis. And so we typically try to talk about the importance of increasing critical thinking and racial literacy as an aspect of everything that we do on our jobs, or that can be translatable to other issues. So to think really critically about whatever it is you're teaching and thinking and making the connections for folks would be important. The others picks back on what Milton was talking about, was really looking at ourselves as the instrument or as a teacher and the facilitator, it's incredibly challenging work. But it's important for us to also assess our own feelings and triggers. I have this quote here by Kathy Obear, and it's based on an article she's written based on 20 years of doing this work. Whether conscious of it or not, facilitators and participants bring most, if not all, of who they are into the learning environment, including their fears, biases, stereotypes, memories of past trauma, and current life events. What does this do in terms of assessing your own feelings and triggers? How is it that you feel when you talk to someone who holds a different view about race or racism? I used to be one of those type of people say, oh, you know, it might anger me a little bit, but I'm able to be there in the moment. But considering the new election and under Trump, I find it really difficult. So even though, like, I'm trying to listen to the CPAC, I'm trying to listen, you know, I have a hard time trying to hear what Rush Limbaugh might say. I literally feel sick to my stomach. And so it's important that I begin to realize that, no, when I hear people espouse very views that contradict what I believe and are not consistent with my values, sometimes that is incredibly difficult, and I need to be aware of that and how that might, how I might react to that. And that helps me keep calm and balanced in the moment so that I'm not overcome with my own affect, which is going to influence the dynamic in the room. What are your fears about talking about racism in the classroom? This I find particularly, just to put it out there, that many times white individuals have more difficulty with that than I think people of color, but maybe that's my own stereotype. And then what are these emotional triggers for you? Do they relate to previous memories of past traumas or current life experiences? And I think that's incredibly powerful. I know in terms of working with the police, I remember thinking about Michael Brown. And we were working with the police after that time and being overcome with sadness and grief after not only the incident, but after the officer was found not guilty, wasn't, that was acquitted. And we were in our team meeting, and I was wiped out. My partner were wiped out. We're both African Americans. And the folks who were white were like, and these are anti-racist folks that are like, you're really wiped out about that? That's having that kind of an impact? And not that they weren't trying to be empathic. It was just that that wasn't reflective of maybe past traumas that they've had when they're, or they're not thinking about their children or nephews or whatever can be an influence. So I think it's important to figure what are those triggers for us and how those triggers relate to our own social identities. And everybody has different triggers. Name the resistance in the moment. I think this is really important. One of the things that it's difficult and it's challenging, but just because you don't name it in the moment doesn't mean that other people don't see it. It doesn't mean that they don't recognize it. And so we've got to name the elephant in the room. Part of then doing this is that is helpful is to return to those discussions about norms around discomfort and norms around resistance. And when folks talk about race, you'll be surprised that you have no idea where it's going to come from. It's not like you can predict when people are going to respond a different way. So I remember we had a community panel, and this is talking to police officers. It was a community panel. Folks had a very visceral response to the only African American on the panel. Afterwards, we talked about, it seems that there was discomfort and resistance. People were hostile to him. We start naming it. And what it came around was they were hostile to him the minute he mentioned having that conversation or the conversation with his son. And the conversation is a conversation about what do you do when a police stops you? Well, we had no idea that people would have, that would be a trigger for folks. That allowed us to then unpack, well, what does that conversation really mean? And why was it there's a resistance? And that led to a really helpful understanding. That was resolved by another police officer who's now helping us do the training, really saying, well, what is the content of the conversation? The comfort is be polite, don't, and the response is, isn't that what we should train everybody? Isn't that what we should teach everyone? And it would allow us a space to revisit our norms and talk about the discomfort. Timing is everything. If those people are doing therapy, you don't bring up a bombshell 10 minutes before the final, 10 minutes before the session ends. So here you think about, when do I want to bring something up and at what level? Because you address it now does not mean that you can't go into something deeper later on. So there's some written activities, there's some other processing activities that can happen. Listen to what is being said and what is not being said in the exchange, and trust your interpretation. In the room, in the moment, people are incredibly skilled at throwing it back on you and having you seem like you're the crazy one, and what's going on in the room is nothing what you were anticipating. I'm going to rush through, and I'm happy to answer questions later on. Invite multiple perspectives and perspective taking, and this allows people to develop a sense of empathy and understanding for others. So what are your views and interpretations or feelings about the topic? What are other ways to think and feel about this? Connect that to their social identities. And I think that helps people then get out of themselves in some ways. Incorporate writing into the actual exchanges. I think that this is important, and the writing doesn't have to be right there in the moment. You can create norms around writing, like assigning regular writing assignments, like these critical incident questionnaires or guided inquiries, where you can have folks complete these every week or every couple of weeks, like what's working well in the class, what's standing out, what are some barriers to your learning. So that can give you some information, and it gets folks thinking about, how do I process things? Encourage dialogue outside of the class, so there can be some written dialogue there using Blackboard or Compass. And then in the moment, you can create writing activities. You can have them write out the situation and their feelings for 5 minutes and then talk about that. Or you can say, anonymous, what are some unanswered questions you have? And then collect those anonymously. Connect the class dynamics. I'm going to quickly go through this because my time is up. But connect the class dynamics to these larger social dynamics. What's happening in the classroom is happening out there. Leanne Bell does a really nice job of talking about what are these stories that we tell ourselves and how these stories are connected to these larger society. And one story is the stock story, meaning the story in which racism doesn't matter. And there's ways that you can do that. A couple of things are process with a colleague. This is incredibly important. Some folks that I know that do this talk about needing hazard pay because it's so difficult. So you want to talk to a colleague. This is what happened. What does this make sense? Help me understand the dynamics some, and also getting support for your own reactions. You want to summarize the learning opportunity and experience for folks there. You want to reiterate the critical incident. You want to reflect on the multiple perspectives being shared. Encourage a discussion on the lessons learned, and then identify potential follow-up tasks. That really helps with meaning making. And then just evaluate your actions and make any changes accordingly. I think I'll leave there. I'll leave my slides about just their strategies to promote inclusion. I would be happy to revisit those during the Q&A. But right now, I'd like to open it up for questions.
We have about, thank you, Milton and Helen. We have about 27 questions, comments. And about 30 minutes to address the questions. Let me see. One is about whether the slides will be available. The slides will be available on the website of Scrum.
Yolanda, I think that those have all been answered so far.
Okay.
I haven't seen any new ones yet. Do we have any new ones? Anybody? Not seeing any.
Okay, there's a question here. How do I reconcile students of color to have to suffer the language of others in the dialogue? Oh, and then it says, ignore the question. Helen or Milton, do you want to comment about it? How do I reconcile students of color to have to suffer the language of others in the dialogue?
Helen, do you want to take that one first?
So I'm sorry. So the question has to do with how is it that you help people, students of color, kind of deal with having to be subjected to this language of oppression, oppressive dialogue. I think that's really important, and that connects to one of the points that I was going to make earlier. It's important that whoever's facilitating the discussion note some of the silences in the room. So if a social justice perspective is not there in the room, that they would step in and provide that social justice perspective and to name what it is. So it could be like, if I was, you know, that this feels uncomfortable in a lot of ways, and that they would and name why it feels uncomfortable. Other ways that I've seen people do it is to reinforce what students of color are saying, or reinforce the position that you think a student of color might say. I think that Daryl Wing Sue has some really nice things in his book about race talk. Part of it is to name, to call people out. I feel comfortable in calling people out. I know other people don't, but I might say, when I hear you say that, this, it makes me feel uncomfortable. It invalidates my experiences, and it reinforces some of the other things that I've been going through. I don't try to put it on the onus of responsibility on students of color, because that calls them out and it highlights them in some ways, and it makes them feel even more uncomfortable. Other ways of doing it is bringing out Daryl Wing Sue's talk, and he has a race talk, and he's got a nice little, like, how student of color voices are silenced and what that means, and then open that up for conversation. So those are some ideas that I have.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to set up the norms and actually ask the students at the beginning, what would you like those norms to be? How would you want to have the conversation so the students can actually articulate, we want to respect each other, we want to recognize what people say. And I think it's important to walk them through and give them the opportunity to articulate those norms of the conversation.
Yolanda, I'd be happy to take the next question about diversity statement in the syllabus.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just want to mention that I am doing some work around developing a diversity-centered syllabus. So it's important for us to take a look at our syllabus, and in what ways does our syllabus reflect and embrace our appreciation for diversity. So starting with, let's just go with the traditional sections, right? So the course description. Is there a section in the course description that notices that, or notes that diversity factors will be addressed in this course? In some instances, that's not the case. Oftentimes, it's just the content of the course, and there is no reference to diversity or a cultural excerpt of any sort. I've seen some folks put in the standard catalog description, and then they'll say, my course description, and then they will add other aspects that are missing. So that's one way to do that. With respect to including a diversity statement, you might want to look at what statement does the university make around civility and appreciation for diversity, and consider perhaps including that in your syllabus. And again, not buried toward the end in your appendix, but front and center, really communicating to students that it's important and it matters. Mm-hmm. Helen kind of mentioned this, but you know, in your learning objectives, is there a learning objective related to diversity and culture, multiculturalism? In your readings, what voices are being reflected in the readings? And can you make sure that there are diverse perspectives and students are being exposed to diverse perspectives? What do your assignments look like? Do your assignments tend to favor one group over another group? Are your assignments inclusive and are they equitable? I've seen some folks say, this is my goal, and you can communicate to me that you can reach this goal in several ways. And some people have said you could do it this way, you can do it that way, and you create a space for people to meet their goal that way. Just some things to be mindful of. When the student sees your syllabus, does it say this is a diversity-centered syllabus?
Milton, there is a question for you here regarding the study you described. I am wondering if the study was done with participants who were ethnically diverse, and any differences in chair spacing for confederates of similar versus different ethnicity to these diverse participants.
The study that I'm aware of, and they may have done an adaptation, or they may have done this study with other ethnic minority groups. The only study I'm aware of is the one that Claude Steele did, where the Confederates, in this case, there weren't actual Confederates. It was just pictures of Polaroid pictures of African American or Black students with white students. But if we're interested in understanding if we're going to create what are our biases, and will our biases lead to us creating a space, we can always visit, the implicit association test at Harvard, and we can complete those tests and look and learn a little bit more about our own biases toward the Latinx community, the LGBTQ community, and other communities that we might have a bias to. We might create these spaces with.
There's another comment and question. Congratulations, it was an excellent talk. The recommendations are very concrete. One of my frustrations is that there is little evidence for this work that we do. What would you recommend we do to build a research base in this area of pedagogy? I think it's really important to be able to write about these issues, to do research, and we're able to document the narratives of the students who experience these discussions, who take these courses, require more of academic institutions that these courses about diversity, inclusion, or race require and not elective, because you often get students who want to have this conversation in these classes. And I think if we can accumulate these stories and write about what it takes to run a course like this, a conversation like this, what are some best practices, reviews of the literature, comments from students. So we really need to publish more about this topic so that we can advance pedagogy in terms of teaching about having meaningful conversations about diversity. Do you want to add, Helen?
Yeah, I would love to add. In addition to what Yolanda was saying, I think that there is some related areas that they do have research on and even meta-analyses on, and those are the difficult dialogue courses, which are a little bit different than what we're doing, but it's also very similar. So building on the difficult dialogues. What I noticed though is that there's not a lot of research that deals with process and outcome. What are the process that learning? Where there seems to be the most effective ingredients? So I love that question, and what we need is some kind of cross-institutional database in which folks, we could apply for a grant to really begin to look and document and research these issues. So it's definitely a gap in the literature, and I'm hoping that the person who asked the question might be motivated to establish these cross-institutional kind of collaborations to create this, yeah.
There's another question I think goes to you, Helen. Please talk more about resistance in the classroom. The last speaker talked about the students denying problems, don't want to talk about race, and then point the finger at the instructor for the audacity in bringing up the topic in the first place. Helen?
Okay, so people will always be uncomfortable, and you have to kind of sit with that. I'll give a couple of examples. One example is around, and there's many stories similar to what I'm going to say. I'm supervising an African-American doctoral student a while ago who was teaching a course. And in the course, she commented on a racial dynamic and challenged the students that were predominantly white. And the students then turned around and said, oh no, you're the one who's making it a racial issue. We don't have that issue. And so she came back to them and said, no, I really think this is. And then the one student who made the racial comment that made her feel insensitive began to cry. And then what ends up happening is that everyone then turns their attention to the white student who's crying and then blaming the Black professor for making the white student cry. And so it becomes, it deracializes it. And so we get into those that's a really sticky situation, and you needing to be very firm on, no, this is a racial dynamics, bringing in articles, like Lisa Spanierman has an article on this, and then unpacking that. So you've got to be vigilant in addressing that, because it operates in ways that you might not even know. Other kinds of resistance that you have to kind of sit with. The reason why I incorporate writing a lot in all the classes, and even those classes that don't explicitly talk about race, or even though they should. I taught a Psych of Women course one time. My friend's daughter was with me. She's like, you know what they're saying about you on Rate My Professor? I was like, you know, I really don't care. I don't really want to know what they're saying. No. So she starts pulling up all the reviews. And one of the review was like the audacity of her to talk about, you know, what is it like to be in a class with a Black woman as a faculty member. We processed that. And she's like, that's completely irrelevant. So she didn't mention that in the class itself. She waits and puts this on ratemyprofessor.com. So now I have things in the mechanisms by having these writing stuff, really observing silences so that we can then talk about that. And with the understanding, you're going to piss people off. And for some, you won't resolve the issue.
Thank you.
I'd like to also add, Yolanda. I think we're getting a little feedback. I think there's a lot to be learned from motivational interviewing, right? So we know that folks are going to walk into these spaces, and there's going to be a fair amount of resistance. There's going to be a fair amount of discord between us and folks in the room. And so we know how we can go about facilitating the right mindset, right? Getting students to think about how this work relates to their goals, how this work relates to their values. And that kind of creates this space where they might become receptive to having this conversation with us. It's not helpful if folks are going to have the mindset that isn't going to facilitate behavioral change or attitudinal change. So I really encourage folks to think about how we can adapt motivational interviewing in these spaces to get folks to embrace attitudes they wouldn't ordinarily embrace.
Thank you. The next question, do you have thoughts about how early in life should students be exposed to these principles? This question reminded me, I had an African-American student with a 5-year-old daughter, and this is a course on race, culture, and health disparities. And we're talking about these issues of race. And usually the course attracts 20 students from different fields, and half are Caucasian and the other half are diverse students. And the mother talked about her 5-year-old daughter really wanted very hardly a white doll. And the mother started the conversation of why you want a white doll. And she said, because that's what I see everywhere. And so we started having the conversation as a class. How do you introduce these topics to children? And I think the early they become part of the conversation, the better for the students. They become better citizens. They start understanding the differences and the commonalities and the benefits of being in a diverse world and how to respect each other. We have a lot of other questions, but Milton or Helen, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I agree.
Okay. The next question, I'm curious about your perspective on scaffolding a student's exposure to these topics and conversations from lower to upper level courses, for example?
That's a great question, and I think that's more contextual. So thinking through where does the department stand with respect to diversity and multiculturalism? Is it part of the department's mission statement? And then how does that get translated into learning objectives, and then learning objectives across the major, so on and so forth. I think, like for example, for those folks who are operating APA accredited programs, I think APA has gotten pretty good about talking about these are the elements that are relevant to diversity. How do you build these elements into these courses? How do you talk about the knowledge and the skills and the attitudes that are needed to do this work? And in what courses is this going to happen? So I think it's a worthwhile endeavor.
The other point that I would like to add to that is sometimes it's exhausting for the faculty responsible for teaching specific courses tailored to race, diversity, inclusion. So they are necessary, but often what we do here is that we not only offer the courses, but we embed and thread diversity throughout the curriculum. And I think that's an important thing to do as well. We have another question. How do you encourage fellow colleagues who embed issues of diversity in their course and help them feel comfortable doing it, specifically if they don't feel equipped to do it? You know, one of the things that we've done here at UIC in my department is that we bring those conversations first to faculty and bring speakers to help us and consultants to help us see how do we embed it throughout the curriculum instead of just having one person responsible for offering those courses. Offer the courses, but then bring it up in faculty meetings. I really want us to talk about diversity and how do we embed diversity throughout the curriculum, bring in consultants or speakers who could work with faculty, do trainings and in-service to faculty on how to embed diversity throughout. Milton or Helen, do you want to add to that?
Just quickly, I loved what you were saying, Yolanda, and I think those are important. And this really then speaks to us not talking about our work that we do individually, but how we change the structures in which we work in, and that there are ways in which we push our department, but also the university to make policies around this. So not only are there resources available, but there's policies around this. And what I find is to incentivize things are really important. So in our department, working with our department, say around, let's talk about their annual evaluations and incorporating this diversity piece as part of faculty's annual evaluation. How do we make that happen? How do we, you know, and then we provide support in order to do that. We provide mentorship to assist faculty in doing that. But I find if things aren't incentivized, then it's hard to motivate faculty to in that direction, especially if we don't have the other resources that are available to them.
Yeah, and I think institutions and departments have to be intentional about embracing diversity as a value and in praxis. That's a statement that I read from Sarah. Two more questions. Unfortunately, this kind of work falls on the shoulder of faculty of color. It becomes taxing and exhausting. As the only faculty of color among 24 white faculty and 50% students of color, how do you tackle this issue of inclusion? That's an excellent question.
And not an uncommon scenario, unfortunately.
Yes.
And so really thinking through, you know, it's good to kind of enlist the support of the chair and the dean. Oftentimes faculty who teach these courses, this makes its way into student evaluations, and this affects the reappointment and tenure and promotion process. And so when you write up your narrative for tenure or reappointment or promotion, or you have to explain problematic student evaluations, it's important to bring in the literature and what the literature says. There's some good literature around folks who have to teach these courses. Just like the folks who teach statistics oftentimes will get problematic student evaluation, and it's got less to do about the faculty member, but more to do about the topic itself. So really kind of making sure that that gets built in, because it's not uncommon when we start doing this work with students, depending on where they are in terms of change, they could get frustrated, they can get angry, and before we get a chance to really see them in a space where they're in a much better space, which might happen months from now, what you get is the anger and so really kind of getting, I think it's important to have this conversation with the department, making sure that everybody is committed to this work, that it doesn't just fall on the person of color to do this work. And as Helen mentioned earlier, you know, engaging in self-care. This is taxing work. There's some good stuff out there. I think one of the higher ed forums has an individual who focuses specifically on diversity and how to kind of care for yourself as a person of color who's doing the diversity work. So you might want to check that out. I'll see if we can share that as a resource later on.
Yeah, we have in the slides, the last slide has some resources, web pages of universities that have within the Center for Teaching and Learning a lot of materials about diversity and embracing diversity throughout the curriculum. The other strategy that has been helpful for me often is being able to build connections and relationships with other departments that are probably ahead of us, that are doing it better, or the faculty who are doing the same and are pretty committed to this, because we can learn from one another or provide support to one another. I have one more question, the last question. I heard difficult dialogues phrase as courageous conversations. Do you have thoughts about that terminology? And Milton, I think you used it in your talk. Courageous conversations?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we need to be open to whatever terms are going to allow us to have this conversation. So if the terms we're using, I was just thinking, like I'd love to just kind of bring this to students and get the terms that they would be comfortable using. What kind of space would you call this? Would you call this a safe space, a courageous space, a brave space? They might even have a different term, and let them help us create the terminology. But absolutely, I appreciate the spirit of the question, which is, you know, are the terms we're using going to facilitate a conversation, or are they going to inhibit the conversation? And that's a great question to ask ourselves.
Yeah. And I think it's often referred as courageous conversations as well, because it requires a level of self-reflection and invite the students and the facilitator to do a lot of self-reflection. And that's, for some people, that's kind of difficult. And of course, self-reflection and opening up about decisions and recognizing one's biases and stereotypes, that could be really difficult. Helen, you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one other thing too, that I love this idea about the courageous conversations and creating courageous spaces. And I think that could be set for any particular class. You're teaching statistics, you're teaching, whatever class, you have that. And when I think about difficult dialogues, that could be part of this courageous conversation. But I think that there's a whole area called difficult dialogues, and there's lots of studies and some centers on university campuses that deal with the difficult dialogues. And sometimes the difficult dialogues are specific courses where they are difficult, they're called difficult dialogue courses, which teaches college students how to engage in folks who have a disagreement, and they cover many of the things that we've been talking about over the last, hour and a half. But it's a particular methodology and a specific approach that there's been lots of stuff written on.
We have one more question. Two more questions. How can we encourage people stuck in their own beliefs to be more open to learning about other experiences or beliefs?
Again, I would say let's take a page out of the motivational interviewing. I mean, if motivational interviewing has evolved considerably over the past 40 years, right? It was used to get folks to stop using substances. Now it's being used to help folks engage in treatment, engage in healthy behaviors. So I really find it very helpful in the classroom to help create a space for healthy dialogue, for helpful dialogue.
Yeah. Along the same lines, Milton, this is a question for you. Do you think that we as catalysts of change are using the tenets of motivational interviewing? Please explain how or how not. And how you think it could be improved upon, if at all.
I think absolutely. We were when Yolanda and I and Helen and I were planning the talk. We talked about whether it would be helpful to include a slide. And I think there are tenets of a motivation interview that would be very helpful, right? Kind of expressing empathy, understanding the positions of everybody in the room, really having some compassion for where those positions came from. Developing discrepancy, getting people uncomfortable with attitudes and behaviors they're comfortable with. And there are very specific questions that we can ask to develop that discrepancy. Supporting self-efficacy, if folks kind of go off and, they expose themselves to something new, a diverse perspective, a new conversation. I'm teaching a course on motivation interviewing right now, and so I'll say, did anybody try anything we talked about last week? And I actually tried it, and they come back, and I want to celebrate that. I want to acknowledge that. And so if they're taking our work outside of the classroom and using it in the real world, quotation marks, that's great. Then we're having an impact. So there's there's also rolling with the resistance or rolling with the discord. Sometimes we feel compelled to respond to everything. And sometimes just a simple reflection will allow us to acknowledge what's being said and then encourage other perspectives. Okay, so that's a perspective. What's another way of thinking about this topic? And that, we don't necessarily have to single that person out or make them feel bad, but it allows us to broaden the conversation and invite other perspectives into the space so that we can think it through and deconstruct effectively.
Thank you. We have last one comment. Stephen John Quaid of ACPA does self-care education on diversity. So thank you for that resource. I want to be mindful of the time, so thank you everyone for joining us.
Yolanda, you have one person with their hand raised. I'm going to
okay. Where is that? How do I see that?
I'm going to let her speak. Okay, Bertha?
She's mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment in terms of Helen's comment about the story of the girl who talked about the kind of the nerve of you as a Black professor. And I kind of relate that. I cannot think of this lady's name, this professor's name. She's at the University of Georgia. And she did a book on diversity and resistance. And she does organizational development work, but I can't think of her name. But anyway, one of the things that she talks about in terms of resistance it's a theme it's an edited book, and it's a theme that sort of runs through many of the chapters in the book, is that that is not so much what is important in terms of what happens in the official meeting in an organization, okay? I mean, you have those dynamics, but where the real resistance really manifests itself is in informal structures. That is, in conversations after the meeting, where the conversation is about what happened in the meeting, okay? And how people kind of structure their experience of the meeting, okay? And that's, she contends is sort of where the intervention has to be. It's not in terms of what's actually said, but what's said in the informal structure. What is the narrative about the narrative? Is, I believe, how it's put. And I think that would be, figuring out how to tap into that whole notion of the narrative after the narrative in the learning environment would be something kind of interesting to try to do in the classroom, especially since, the classroom is a situation where basically the same people meet several times over time, so you don't have to bring it up immediately. But after, people have kind of become more comfortable with both each other and the subject matter. That was my only comment, but I really have enjoyed this.
Thank you.
I love that comment. Thank you so much, and I will definitely give that some thought about how to have people reflect on the conversations they've had after the class, and what were those like. I think that's brilliant. Thank you so much.
About the class, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. How are they processing it outside of the class? How are they making it? What is the narrative there? I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank the panelists, Helen and Milton. Thank you for joining me in this effort. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And have a good afternoon. And we will make the slides available through the Sprout website. Thank you.
Everybody, take care.
So, Milton and Helen, before we actually place all the slides, I just want to make sure that we have all the references listed, because there are a few sites that are not listed on the reference.